Hey guys, it's Eshani, aka Total Makeup Junkie 101. So today I have the review video that so many of you guys have been waiting for. Today we are going to be talking all about the new Anastasia Beverly Hills eyeshadow palette in Subculture. This product has been receiving just the most polarizing reviews that I've ever seen on a makeup product. So today I will be sharing my personal experience with this palette and let you guys know what I personally think about it. So first and foremost, let's talk about the basics. I purchased this palette directly off of the Anastasia Beverly Hills website when it initially launched. It retails for $42, and at this time I believe you can pick it up online at Sephora as well. Now Subculture is said to be the sister palette to Modern Renaissance, which we all know and most of us love the Modern Renaissance palette. So I think when Subculture originally launched, people were so excited about it. The outer packaging of the palette is pretty much the same thing as Modern Renaissance. It has like that velvety texture to it, but it is in this kind of muted teal. The palette is held shut by a magnet, and then when you open it up, you can see that you are getting 14 different shadows. You're also getting a double-ended brush here at the bottom. One side is kind of like a flat side, and then one side is a fluffy side. As with all of my review videos, this is going to be my own experience with the product, my own thoughts. Just remember that review videos are very subjective, and this is just my own opinion on it. But I just have to say that I personally don't love this palette or hate this palette. That really isn't what I was hoping for when I purchased this. Obviously, I wanted to love this palette just as much as I loved Modern Renaissance because they are supposed to be like sister palettes. Now, before we jump into talking about the texture of these shadows, the color selection, and my personal experience with the wear, let's go ahead and just jump into swatches of this entire palette so you can see how the colors look on my skin tone. Here is the top row of the Subculture palette swatch. From left to right, we have Cube, Dawn, Destiny, Adorn, All-Star, Mercury, and Axis. As you can see, the mattes in this palette swatch absolutely beautifully, but I will say that the two shimmers that are in this palette don't swatch out as well as I was expecting them to. And here's the second row in the palette. From left to right, we have Roxy, Electric, Fudge, New Wave, Untamed, Edge, and Rowdy. Again, the mattes in this row swatch out really beautifully, but the shimmery color is kind of it's okay. Really quickly, I did want to jump into talking about the color selection of this palette. Obviously, just by looking at the palette, it is significantly darker, and it does have some more kind of, I want to call them muted dark pops of color. It kind of verges the spectrum from cool and warm. It's interesting, I will say that. I definitely can't look at this palette and think, oh yeah, it looks just like another palette I already have. The color selection is definitely unique. Now let's talk about the texture of this palette. This is where things are gonna get a little bit hazy, because I think you're either going to love the texture or you're not. Speaking of the mattes, which is actually the majority of this palette, there are only 3 shimmery colors, and that would be this one, and this one. The other 11 colors are all matte, and I will say that these mattes are probably the most pigmented matte eyeshadows I have ever used. They top my Viseart shadows, they top my Natasha Denona shadows. Those are 2 brands of matte eyeshadow that I really, really love, which is why I'm comparing them. These are even significantly more pigmented, in my opinion, than the Modern Renaissance mattes. All of that pigmentation definitely comes at a price. As you probably know and have probably heard, these shadows are powdery. I mean, I thought the Modern Renaissance had kick up, and I thought these were pretty powdery, but these eyeshadows, I've never experienced as much powder kick up as I have with this palette. This is a palette where you literally need to dip your brush into the powder lightly and one time, and you will have plenty of shadow to get it all over your eyes. Now, for people who love super pigmented shadows, that might be a pro. For me, I don't find that very user-friendly. I don't want to have to relearn how to use eyeshadow, and generally within just all of the shadows that I love and have used, I can take a fluffy brush and just kind of swirl it in a pan of product and slowly build up the color as I want. I feel like that also helps shadow blend. It helps shadow look more diffused and effortless versus putting my brush in one of these matte shadows and then placing it on my eye and just getting this really strong punch of color and then trying to diffuse it and really just making my eyeshadow look muddy. I don't know if it's the color scheme that's in here that just doesn't work within itself, because I feel like a lot of these colors, when you start blending them together, they look muddy. Many of the eye looks that I have done with this palette have eventually turned gray. I'm sure there's some color theory behind that, but I will say when there's one eyeshadow palette given to you, and if this is the only thing that you're using to travel with, I don't want to have to worry about, okay, let me mentally think which colors work together, which colors, if I combine them, are going to turn gray on me. I don't want to have to worry about that. I want to know that my eyeshadow palette works with itself very well, and I don't really feel like this palette does that. I don't know about these mattes. They're just too pigmented and too powdery, and you have to reteach yourself to learn eyeshadow when you use these. I like my makeup application technique. I don't feel like I want to have to alter it according to the palette that I use. Now, in terms of these shimmer shadows, which, like I said, there's only 3 of them, I thought these were going to be absolutely glorious, but I will say they are a little bit flakier to work with. You can use brushes in them and pack them on, and they will deliver a punch of color, but depending on your application method, you might need to build them up a little bit. The shimmers were not one swipe pigmented, at least not for me, and I do find that a little bit of an issue because the mattes are so incredibly pigmented that I can barely tap my brush into the mattes and get way more product than I need on my eyes. But for the shimmers, I actually have to take my brush and kind of dig it in the pan to pull up enough product to use on my eyes. So now, not only am I altering my application method for this palette, but I'm altering the application method I'm using between the different textures of shadows. That just gets really complicated. I genuinely don't feel like for $42 makeup should have to be that complex. One more major thing I did want to address with this palette, which is an issue I did not have with the Modern Renaissance palette, is the staying power. These shadows on my oily eyelids don't last very long. I always use a primer. I use my NARS Smudge Proof Eyeshadow Base, which is probably one of the best primers on the market. I've used it in combination with every other eyeshadow that I have in my collection, high end, low end, everything in between, and it's never posed any issue. However, there is something to do with this formula that will crease on me and will fade throughout the day. That's unfortunate because obviously nobody wants their eyeshadow to be fading off of their eyelids, especially when you take the extra step of using a primer, but I guess my oily eyelids just can't handle something that's in this formula. So here's a little side-by-side of the Subculture palette next to the Modern Renaissance palette. Subculture is on the top, Modern Renaissance is on the bottom. You can see that overall Subculture does have darker colors. You're obviously getting more cool toned colors, but I really wouldn't say Subculture is completely cool toned either. Versatility wise, Modern Renaissance wins. I can definitely take this palette very easily from day to night. I love this palette. Subculture, pretty much every look I've done with this palette is dark. That's just the color scheme that you're offered in here. You can obviously mix this palette with Modern Renaissance or any other palette that you have to kind of lighten up the eyeshadow look. I think this is a palette you would probably have to swatch in person or really look at yourself, because This is just gonna be a very personal preference type thing. But just to let you guys know, if I ever ran out of Modern Renaissance, I would 100% go and repurchase. I would not repurchase Subculture. Now for a few housekeeping things, just to let you guys know, this palette is made in the US. The brush that's in here, which I actually have over here, is made in China. I went ahead and compared the ingredient list between the Subculture palette and the Modern Renaissance. They have really simplified the ingredients in the Subculture palette versus the Modern Renaissance. It seems like they've taken out a lot of the fillers and really just kept this palette like a pigmented, just pure pigment palette. And while in theory that sounds good because pigments are very expensive, it doesn't always serve the consumer well to have a super pigmented formula that is difficult to blend and difficult to work with. Also, just another thing to note, the Modern Renaissance shades are generally mica based, whereas the Subculture palette is generally talc based. I personally don't have any issues using talc, but I know some people have talc sensitivities or they just prefer not to use that ingredient. So just know that the first ingredient in all of these shadows is talc. The price per gram breakdown is exactly the same as Modern Renaissance. These are both $42. You get 14 shadows in here at 0.7 grams a piece, which means you are getting 9.8 grams of product total. That means that you are paying $4.29 per gram for this palette, which I will say is pretty expensive because of how insanely pigmented these colors are. I'm sure it was really expensive to make this palette, but I don't see this as a very user-friendly palette. That's just my personal take on the palette. So overall, I don't love it, I don't hate it, but I definitely do not recommend it. Just my honest opinion. So there we have it. That is my video for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. In case you guys didn't know yet, I did start my own makeup line and we have 6 lipsticks and 6 liquid lipsticks available, which you can shop through that link up there. I will also go ahead and put a subscribe link to my channel right down there for you. But that is everything. Thank you guys again for your love and support. I really appreciate it. And I will talk to you guys in my next video on Thursday. I'll see you then. Bye.